Since 1960, at the age of 7, I've had a fascination with the Titanic. Over the years, I've kept running into Titanic-related experiences, sometimes when I least expected it. The following is not necessarily a story about the Titanic. That story can be found in numerous books and documentaries. But it's the story of my various encounters with things Titanic over the years. Back in 2000, I took a trip to the UK to shoot documentary footage for what I called my Titanic tour, traveling to Titanic-related sites from Belfast to Paris. I shot video, lots of standard definition non-widescreen video, and never did anything with it. The footage just sat there, getting older and older. HD and widescreen took over, and I kept putting the project on the back burner. I decided to edit it all together, but I was concerned that once finished, it would just be a disembodied fragment of video clips about my trip. So I chose to start from the very beginning, which in the 60s was a very good place to start. So in order to correctly tell this story, I have to talk about some of my other interests, because at times they intersect. One was the TV program Lost in Space, produced by Irwin Allen. In 1965, every Wednesday night I watched the show. And in 1990, I decided to do something I'd been thinking about since 1965. I built, from scratch, my own Lost in Space robot. It took me a few years, but I finally finished it and showed it off at a few conventions. I guess I did a good job because I was asked to do some work on the original robot. So right around 1994-95, I became the robot tech for several of the Lost in Space specials that were produced. And in 1997 was asked to tour with the robot to help promote the Lost in Space New Line movie that was going to be released in April of '98. Now, let's get back to Titanic. For the most part, I'm telling this story in sequence, with short tangents as to some of the other things I was doing at the time. So for those of you that are interested, this is my story. I grew up in Somerset, Massachusetts. Back in 1960, I was in the second grade at the Wilbur School, and my second grade teacher was Miss McAndrew. I remember Miss McAndrew saying something like, "And now I'm going to tell you all about the Titanic." She went on to explain to the class what had happened that fateful night, at that time only 48 years before. I wanted to learn more about the Titanic, so I went to the school library and tried to check out the Titanic book, A Night to Remember, by Walter Lord. But it was always checked out before I could borrow it, and I had to wait for weeks. Finally, there it was. In the middle of the 1960s, I had begun to collect what they called short subjects on 8mm film. These were edited 8mm home movie digest versions of highlights from older Hollywood films. A company called Blackhawk Films was famous for releasing vintage classic silent movies. There were comedies, dramas, and some newsreels. One of those newsreels was a short film named simply Titanic. I used to watch this film on my 8mm projector all the time. The film was a reissue of a short newsreel created in 1912. It was rushed into production to take advantage of the hysteria after the Titanic disaster. The footage was highly inaccurate because many of the shots that were supposed to be of the Titanic were in reality shots of Titanic's sister ship, Olympic, shot about a year before the Titanic disaster. But I still considered the footage a way to look back through time to 1912. As I said earlier, during the 1960s, I really liked the Irwin Allen shows like Lost in Space and also Voyage to the Bottom of the Sea. I liked them so much, I built a set in the basement, pulled out my 8mm camera, and shot my own versions of the shows. The Time Tunnel, the newest Irwin Allen series, premiered in September of 1966. When I saw the listing in the TV guide for the episode Rendezvous with Yesterday, which took place on the Titanic, I couldn't wait to watch. In the episode, the two main characters, Tony and Doug, tried to convince the captain of his ship's fate, but to no avail. Some of the footage in this episode was borrowed from the Fox film Titanic, starring Barbara Stanwyck and Clifton Webb. Still to this day, I have the Time Tunnel Viewmaster packet, which has pictures from that very first episode. Later on, I even made my own 8mm version of the Time Tunnel, using my sister, who reluctantly played one of the roles. In the 1960s, we used to get TV Guide in the mail every week. So when I opened it up to see this ad, I knew what I was doing that Thursday night. In March of 1968, the television premiere of the 1958 film A Night to Remember was broadcast by CBS. I remember watching that night as what was once a book I had a difficult time obtaining at the library unfolded in front of me on our big 25-inch TV screen. In 1971, I started college at Wentworth in Boston, Massachusetts. I was studying architectural engineering. Around this time, as a side project, I decided to do a painting of the Titanic. I was living in a dorm on Huntington Avenue in my second year. It took me a couple of months to create this masterpiece. As you can tell, I knew nothing about painting at the time, if it didn't have the little numbers to fill in. Eventually, I decided that architectural engineering, drawing and designing houses and industrial buildings all day wasn't for me. So after Wentworth, I interned at WBZ-TV Channel 4 in Boston, painting, set building, and cutting out over 100 number 4s on a bandsaw and applying them to the news set. I also learned a little about editing news footage and some lighting. It was 1975, and I had just finished doing tech and a bit part on stage for a show at the Charles Playhouse in Boston. I decided I needed a change, so I packed up everything and moved from Boston to Los Angeles. In the late 70s, author Clive Cussler's book Raise the Titanic was published. I bought the book and couldn't put it down. It was a fictional novel about the Titanic and a mysterious radioactive substance that was thought to be on board the ship's maiden voyage. While I was reading the book, I kept thinking of what the movie of the book would look like. To me, if they ever made the movie, it would be great. After several years of working an abundant variety of jobs in Los Angeles, I got a job at the Studio One Backlot Theater doing lights and sound for shows like Joan Rivers, Side by Sondheim, Eartha Kitt, and my future employer, Wayland Flowers and Madam, just to name a few. In 1979 at the Backlot Theater, I did lighting and sound for the Broadway and film director Joshua Logan, who was there at the theater performing in a show with his family. After one of the shows, I heard his daughter call out to a man as he was leaving the dressing room after visiting the Logans backstage. "Have fun raising your Titanic," is what she said. As it turned out, that man was one of the producers who was working on the movie Raise the Titanic, that I learned later would be released in the following summer of 1980. I guess hearing that news prompted me to go out and buy the newest model of the Titanic that had been released just a few years earlier. The summer of 1980 was here, and Raise the Titanic, the movie, was released, with a cast that includes stars like Jason Robards, Richard Jordan, and Alec Guinness. I remember waiting in line at the Cinerama Dome in Hollywood with the anticipation that the film would be even better than the book. It was not. It was very disappointing. There were only a few segments that were memorable. The opening title sequence with the soaring John Barry theme, and because this movie was done before the discovery of the wreck of the Titanic in 1985, the hopeful scenes of the Titanic breaching the surface and finally being towed into New York Harbor. For years later, I fantasized about owning the huge Titanic model from the movie, but unfortunately, on the island of Malta, near the filming tank that was used in the movie, and after years of neglect, the model is slowly rusting away. Late summer of 1980. I saw a story on a local TV station about a Titanic survivor who lived in Hermosa Beach, California. Her name was Edwina Mackenzie. At the time of her voyage, she went by her maiden name, Edwina Trout. She survived the Titanic disaster by getting into collapsible lifeboat D and was rescued in the early morning hours by the Cunard ship, Carpathia. I contacted her after the news story and asked if I could meet her. She accepted my offer, and then, with a Miss Grace lemon cake, made my way down to Hermosa Beach. She welcomed me into her home, and we sat and talked Titanic. Edwina, or Winnie as she was called, was 27 years old when she walked the decks of Titanic. She told me vivid stories of those days aboard the ship, the cold air, the loading of the lifeboats, and the dramatic rescue. She made some tea, and we sat at her kitchen table, talking more Titanic, as we sipped the tea and ate the lemon cake. About a week later, she sent me a very nice thank you postcard. After I met her that evening, I never thought of Titanic the same again. Now, it was real. Provincetown, Massachusetts, late August 1985. I was working with the show Wayland, Flowers and Madam in a nightclub. I was stage managing and doing props. At the same time, about 900 miles east of Provincetown in the North Atlantic, Dr. Robert Ballard, who was on board the research vessel Norse searching for the Titanic, found one of the ship's detached boilers on the ocean floor, and not too far away, the wreck of Titanic. Instantly, newspapers reported the find. I still remember one of my friends calling and telling me the news, but I had already seen the reports. Later in December that same year, National Geographic published an issue about how Ballard found the Titanic, complete with a full complement of pictures and diagrams. Also released the same month was the National Geographic documentary, Secrets of the Titanic. The following summer of '86, I returned to Provincetown again with the Wayland and Madam show, this time for the whole summer. In August, I remember going to a newsstand and picking up this edition of Time magazine with a very interesting title. Spending every single day in Provincetown for the summer gets a little monotonous, so one day, on my day off, I decided to fly into Boston from P-Town to take some pictures, purchase a couple of rhinestone tiaras that Wayland wanted from Adam, and visit my favorite place to get a corned beef on rye, Jacob Worth's, one of the oldest restaurants in Boston. While still in town, I later stopped by a bookstore, and to my surprise, on one of those tables that hold the new books was a large book titled Titanic, Triumph, and Tragedy. With a quick flip-through, I bought the book, went to the airport, jumped back on the DC-3 as I looked out the window at Boston Harbor on a low-flying, bumpy flight back to P-Town. Titanic, Triumph, and Tragedy was written by John P. Eaton and Charles A. Haas, who are world-renowned Titanic experts. The book has had subsequent publishings and is still considered a go-to book for anyone interested in the Titanic. In the late 80s, I started working as a freelance cameraman, shooting low-budget videos, network promos, nightclub and theater performances, and acting reels. At the same time, I was busy slowly building my Lost in Space robot, so Titanic had not been on my mind for a while, until 1994, when A&E television networks produced the documentary Titanic, The Complete Story. This was an excellent documentary narrated by actor David McCallum, who played Junior Wireless Officer Harold Bride in 1958's A Night to Remember. Titanic, The Complete Story was originally broadcast in 2 parts, and it's still considered to be one of the classic Titanic documentaries produced. Also, the IMAX motion picture Titanica was released in the U.S. in 1995 and provided its audiences a close-up look of the then-current site of the wreckage. The release of both these documentaries were my reawakening to Titanic and a stepping stone for years to come. In 1996, director James Cameron had chosen a plot of land just south of Rosarito, Mexico, to build a studio and shoot the exterior and interior scenes for his new film, Titanic. Rosarito is about an hour south of downtown San Diego. It's mainly a tourist city with the beach, the bars, restaurants, and hotels. Things moved quickly as a complete, fully functioning studio was built oceanfront from the ground up for the production. A large tank was built to accommodate the nearly full-size set of Titanic. In December of '96, I saw an article about the production of Titanic in a San Diego newspaper. So weeks before Titanic's principal shooting wrapped in early 1997 at the now Fox Baja Studios, I drove down on a Sunday during the studio's Christmas hiatus with a couple of friends to see what we could see. I only knew that this large Titanic set was somewhere just south from the center of Rosarito. Finally, there it was, with its 4 funnels, the full-sized set of the Titanic. Of course, we couldn't get into the studio, but we went alongside and I took some pictures, and then finally a picture by the front gate. In June of 1997, I was in New York City at a convention with a Lost in Space TV robot promoting the upcoming Lost in Space feature film to be released by New Line in the spring of '98. While I was there, I made a point to go and see Titanic the Musical on Broadway. It was a great show, and it went on to win 5 Tony Awards that year, including one for Best Musical. December 19, 1997 was the date I was waiting for. It was the first public showing of James Cameron's Titanic at the Chinese Theater in Hollywood. I bought my tickets on Thursday afternoon, the 18th, for the midnight show that night, and also for the 11 a.m. show the next morning. Over the next several months, I went back a few times. Titanic was the #1 film for 15 consecutive weeks, taking in over $530 million domestically and over $1 billion worldwide at the time. Commercial and trade publications had Titanic featured on their covers. Here's an interesting fact. Just after Titanic won 11 Oscars in March of 1998, Lost in Space the movie was released on April 3rd. It was Lost in Space that unseated Titanic as it took over the #1 box office spot Titanic had held since December. After the movie had opened, I made several more trips down to Fox Baja Studios in Mexico to visit the Titanic movie exhibit they had set up at the studio. This exhibit on Stage 5 looked like it had been hastily put together with portions of the various sets from the film. The set of the first-class smoking room, first-class lounge, the veranda cafe. Also, various props and models were exhibited. Just outside, there was a display of the larger props from the film, the stern section, crow's nest, a gangway, the compass tower, and a full-sized lifeboat. They were all overlooking the now empty tank where the nearly full-sized set of Titanic once sat with the ocean behind. After a while, the Titanic set tour became a lot more elaborate, with the opening of Foxploration, a sort of theme park built at the studio. With the fountain from the Fox film Hello Dolly as their main street centerpiece, visitors could wander around part of the movie lot. They could also enter the new Titanic exhibit building that had several miniature set pieces and more props and sets on display that had never been seen before at the museum. When the film was finished shooting, the studio demolished most of the sets and disposed of them in a landfill area a few miles away from the studio. Enterprising locals scavenged these pieces and made a cottage industry out of selling them. I bought some of those pieces from several different sources. Over the course of a few years, I restored and reconstructed those set pieces to fit into a guest house I was living in at the time. One of those pieces was the full elevator facade from the D-Deck set, seen here in a reference shot of the actual set. Some of the pieces I purchased had been severely affected by the water, both from the shooting of the film and from the conditions they were subjected to in the fields. I brought them home, hosed them down, stripped, sanded, and fitted them back together. When it came time to finish the set, I wasn't sure what the original painters finished it with. So I called CBS Studio Center's painting department, which was just down the street from me, and arranged a visit. Incidentally, CBS Studio Center happened to be the location of the prestigious Todd A.O. scoring stage where Titanic was scored. So I went down to the studio, and they told me that a set painter down on stage 10 would know exactly what to do. I walked over to stage 10, met the painter, who had been the lead scenic painter for Titanic, who just happened to be there at the studio working on another project. He told me what to do, so I went back home, glazed and finished the pieces, and finally set them up in my very small living room, which didn't have enough room to set all 3 arches up in a row, so they had to be split up. I also had a piece of the railing from the full-size set. Another of the pieces I obtained from the film was a very heavy plaster positive casting of the famous clock from the grand staircase depicting honor and glory crowning time. I molded it, made a fiberglass copy, painted, finished it, and it's now mounted above my fireplace. In 1998, I was invited along with several other people to be interviewed for a segment of the A&E special Beyond Titanic. In the interview, I sat in front of my restored elevator set and spoke about why I collected Titanic items and the beauty and detailed construction of all the sets from the film. In June of '98, I drove about 340 miles up to Santa Clara, California, to the Titanic the Movie on Tour exhibit. The exhibit had several set pieces, props, costumes, as well as the 44-foot model of the Titanic that was built for the film. Over the years, I attended many Titanic exhibits, the Ship of Dreams in Orlando, which had an interesting display of items from the period. The Queen Mary in Long Beach hosted a Titanic exhibit on board. The Rio Hotel in Las Vegas had Titanic the Exhibition until it moved down the street to the Luxor Hotel and changed its name to Titanic the Artifact Exhibition. In April 2000, I set out to visit a few of the various sites in and around the UK that were Titanic relevant. I flew to London from Los Angeles and then took a flight from London to Belfast, Northern Ireland. I had made a bed and breakfast reservation for the ash-rowan townhouse in Belfast before leaving Los Angeles. I heard that it was once called Dunallen and was the home of Thomas Andrews, the architect for Titanic and managing director of the Harland & Wolff shipyard where Titanic was built. The ash-rowan is located at 12 Windsor Avenue, a quiet street, and about a 10-minute ride south of downtown Belfast. I was given a small room on the second floor toward the back. Breakfast was served every morning in what appeared to be the former living room. The home was decorated in reds, patterned wallpaper, and antique furniture. At the time, it was owned by a retired couple who were former restaurateurs. They spoke of the many guests over the years that made the pilgrimage to 12 Windsor Avenue to stay in the former home of the man that designed the Titanic. But as you'll hear later, things were not as they seemed. Titanic was built at the Harland & Wolff shipyards in Belfast under the Arrow Gantry, just off Queen's Road. The Arrow Gantry was a massive structure which was erected for the building of 3 great ships back in the early 1900s, the Olympic, the Titanic, and finally, the Britannic. These 3 liners were built as the new Olympic-class ships by Harland & Wolff for the White Star Line. A small portion of the gantry was devoted to building smaller ships like the ship tenders SS Nomadic and the SS Traffic. Both served Titanic in Cherbourg, France. I took a local taxi to Queen's Road, which bisected the Harland & Wolff shipyards, with most of the actual vintage shipbuilding taking place on the northwest side of the street and the various machine shops on the southeast side. Still standing at the time I shot this video were the great warehouse-sized buildings that built everything from the ship's boilers, engines, to the famous funnels of many liners. It was an eerie experience to walk in this special place where so many people had worked and died on so many of the great ships from the past. One thing to note was how much had changed. The Arrow Gantry had been demolished in the late 1960s, and in its place, the slipways had been used as a parking lot and storage area. Along the former route of the support columns for the gantry were the rusted reminders of what once was. Most of the former shipyard was in ruins. The old timekeeper offices, plumber's shed, and various other buildings were just falling apart. Here's just a few quiet moments at Harland and Wolff. Downtown Belfast is a busy city. Amongst the historic buildings are several Titanic memorials like this one next to City Hall. I met up with my friend Jim Carlisle at one of the most popular meeting places in Belfast, the Crown Bar. Jim's grandfather, Alexander Carlisle, helped build the Titanic as an apprentice riveter at Harland and Wolff, and Jim's dad worked as a driller at the shipyard from 1938 until 1979. Jim was going to take me to a few places around Belfast and the surrounding areas, which in some way were associated with the Titanic. We met up the next morning bright and early, and he took me to Comber, a small town about 10 miles southeast of Belfast. First up was a hearty breakfast at a little bistro near the town square, so I could try the famous Ulster Fry, a traditional breakfast much like bacon and eggs, with some extras. Comber is the birthplace of Thomas Andrews, designer of the Titanic. Adara House is a Victorian manor built in 1872 and sits just off the main road in Comber, and it's where Thomas Andrews grew up with his brothers. Just down the street is the Thomas Andrews Memorial Hall, which is part of the Andrews Memorial Primary School. Across the street is the former Andrews Linen Mill, which was converted into apartments several years ago. We next visited the Ulster Folk and Transport Museum in Cultra. The museum has a very interesting Titanic exhibit, the original Titanic design drawings, models, postcards, and even an original launch ticket. One of the events I was looking forward to going to was the Ulster Titanic Society's annual dinner on Saturday night, April 1st, at the Stormont Hotel in East Belfast. The dinner is held as close to the 2nd of April as possible each year to commemorate the date Titanic left Belfast for her sea trials, and then her maiden voyage. Here I could meet all the personalities and Titanic enthusiasts from the Belfast area and beyond. In attendance were notable people such as 88-year-old Milvina Dean and John Parkinson. Milvina was only 2 months old when she sailed third class on the Titanic with her parents and older brother Bert, and John Parkinson, whose father worked as a joiner on Titanic, and who took little John to watch the launch of Titanic down at the slipways in Belfast on May 31st, 1911. The event was hosted by author and president of the Ulster Titanic Society, Stephen Cameron, with special guest of honor, survivor Milvina Dean. Other speakers were authors Michael McCaughan, Mary Ann Whitley, and author Per Christian Seaback from Norway. The dinner that night was a recreation of one of the dinners served on Titanic. I left Belfast the next day and flew to Glasgow, then took a train to stay the night in Edinburgh. As I was waiting at the counter checking into a small hotel, I heard the sound from a TV in another room blare out, "Danger, Will Robinson, danger." So far, and yet not so far away from home. The next morning I got on the train about 6:30 a.m., as I hoped to get to Alnwick in Northumberland early, so that I would have enough time to spend at my next destination, the White Swan Hotel. The White Swan Hotel sits close to the town center and was an old 18th century coaching inn that now contains some of the paneling and fittings from Titanic's sister ship, the RMS Olympic. Many rooms and fittings on the Olympic were reproduced for the Titanic. The RMS Olympic was scrapped in 1936 and 37, and many of the ship's interiors were auctioned off. The then owner of the White Swan had some of them installed into his hotel. Upon entering the White Swan Hotel, directly ahead is one of the first-class staircases from the Olympic, with the identical woodwork and wrought iron scrolled balustrades that were found on Titanic. Other areas of the hotel also have similar staircase fittings. Paneling from the Olympic's original first-class lounge, which was identical to Titanic's paneling, can be found in the White Swan's Olympic Suite. Here one can see the detailed carvings, the oak paneling, intricate stained and painted glass window inserts, the original marble faux fireplace, and 24-karat gold-plated sconces, all done years ago by the craftsmen at Harland & Wolff. The room now hosts many local functions, wedding receptions, and a variety of other events. I then traveled from Alnwick to Liverpool by train to visit the Merseyside Maritime Museum, which has an interesting collection of Titanic-related items. For one, they had the restored original builder's model of Titanic on display. The model is 18.4 feet long and was built by none other than Harland & Wolff. Other White Star Line memorabilia was on display: Titanic lifeboat plaques and flags, a battered life jacket, and other items from the great Olympic ships of the past. After Liverpool, I took a train back to London and stopped to visit a couple of Titanic landmarks. The first was Downshire House, which was the home of Lord James Peary, who was a partner at the Harland & Wolff shipyard. It is believed that this was the place Peary and Bruce Ismay, who was managing director of the White Star Line, first came up with the idea of building the Olympic class of ships, which started with the Olympic, then Titanic, and later on the Britannic. Today, the building is now the location of the Embassy of Spain. I then visited the Oceanic House, the former London headquarters of the White Star Line, where many passengers purchased tickets for their voyage. It is here that the famous photograph was taken of a newsboy holding a sign that told the news of the disaster. Today, after being an office building and even a Tex-Mex restaurant for many years, it has been converted into luxury apartments and penthouses. I was back on the train for the short ride from London to the port city of Southampton, which is about 80 miles southwest of London. I first stopped by the Titanic Engineers Monument, located in East Park. The monument is dedicated to the engineers who lost their lives in the disaster, as many of Titanic's crew were from Southampton. The Southampton docks are where the Titanic crew prepared the ship for departure and where the passengers first stepped foot on the brand new liner, some traveling for pleasure and comfort, and others to begin a new life. Today, the lodge bollards to which Titanic was actually tied to still sit on the edge of berth number 44. I wanted to get a sense of what it was like out on the same waters that Titanic sailed, so I bought a harbor cruise ride, where I was able to see berth number 44 from the same angle as one of the more famous photographs that were taken of Titanic. This short trip was a great way to see Southampton docks from a different perspective. Later, I stopped by a store called Cobwebs, which is famous for selling ocean liner memorabilia. I purchased this original Titanic-era White Star Line fork and knife. Finally, I visited the Southampton Maritime Museum. One of the most famous artifacts in this museum is the carved oak clock panel depicting honor and glory crowning time. which was aboard the Olympic and Titanic. This particular clock panel is from the Olympic. The actual clock face has been missing since the 1930s. Also at the museum is a copy of the painting that was hung above the fireplace in Titanic's first-class smoking room entitled Plymouth Harbor. It was originally painted by Norman Wilkinson. The original painting was lost, so in 1996, Norman's son Rodney Norman Wilkinson duplicated his father's work with painstaking accuracy in exacting detail. Next to that painting is the painting that was originally over the fireplace in the smoking room of the Olympic, called Approach to the New World. I've substituted this photograph because the original painting was lit by the museum at the time in such a way that it was difficult to show on camera. From Southampton, I headed for Dover and boarded the cross-channel ferry to Calais, France. From Calais, I took the train into Paris. Out my window, the French countryside rolled by. Once in Paris, I did a quick visit to Notre Dame. I saw the famous flying buttresses that I first learned about back at the Wilbur School in Somerset. I walked through the grounds of the Louvre and saw the lines of people waiting to get in. I saw a Ferris wheel and took a quick ride to get some aerial shots of Paris. Next, I went to the Eiffel Tower. I was short on time, and most people go up the tower and look down, so I just stayed underneath the tower and looked up. No lines, and it was free. From the Eiffel Tower, I looked across the River Seine to see what I actually came to Paris to see, one of Titanic's tenders, the SS Nomadic. I walked over to the other side of the river to the paved banks, where the SS Nomadic was docked. The SS Nomadic, the last surviving White Star Line vessel in the world, was built by Harland and Wolff at the same time as the Olympic. It was built by the very same workers, employing many of the same fixtures and fittings that were installed on the Titanic. The Nomadic was used as a tender in Cherbourg, France, specifically for the Olympic-class ships. Over the years, the Nomadic went in and out of tender service, and for a brief period of time was even used as a small troop transport during both World Wars I and II. The SS Nomadic ended its tender service in the late 1960s and eventually ended up here in Paris, docked along the river. For a period of time, it was used as a restaurant and nightclub, and in the late 1990s, everything came to a halt for the SS Nomadic. It just sat there for years, deteriorating slowly. I traveled back to London, headed to the airport, and took a flight home. The next day around noon, I remember arriving in Los Angeles and headed not for home, but directly to a comic convention at the Shrine Auditorium. I remember feeling a little jet lag as I sat in front of a camera for a Lost in Space robot tech interview for a video being produced. It was January of 2003, and I heard there was going to be a new Titanic exhibit at the California Science Center here in Los Angeles. One morning when I turned on the TV, I saw they were preparing the big piece, a large section of Titanic's hull that was brought up from the wreck site, to be hoisted into the museum. I grabbed my camera and headed down there. When I arrived, the hull was resting on wooden blocks, and the workers were prepping it for the lift into the museum with a crane. As I was standing there watching and only inches away from the big piece, I noticed that one of the workers had placed his foot on the hull. I thought, it's like he's stepping onto the Titanic. So I did the same. I went over and asked the guy standing by the big piece if it was very fragile. He bent down and picked some fragments from the hull and placed the small chips off the big piece into my hand. Now I actually had a very little bit of Titanic's hull for my own. Eventually they hoisted the hull section into an upper-story window, and I drove home with my newest possessions. As of this reading, the big piece is now on extended display at the Luxor Hotel in Las Vegas. About this time, through a mutual friend, I met Ken Marshall, the world-renowned painter of Titanic. His paintings and illustrations of Titanic and other great ships are highly sought out. His work as one of the historical advisors for James Cameron's Titanic is responsible for the detailed accuracy of many of the film's sets and miniatures. Ken supplied the paintings for the book Titanic: An Illustrated History. with the text by Titanic historian Don Lynch. This book is my favorite of all the books that I have about Titanic. For the next 14 years, I continued to do freelance video and production work. I was also still doing occasional Lost in Space robot tech work whenever the robot appeared at a convention. I moved from the guest house I had been staying in and had to sell my elevator set pieces. I heard they eventually ended up in a Titanic museum somewhere. For about 5 years, I ran a small boutique soundstage in North Hollywood, designing, building, and painting sets. I occasionally looked at one or more of my Titanic books, but I had to concentrate on other matters. Then in May of 2017, I heard about a new Titanic exhibit opening at the Ronald Reagan Presidential Library in Simi Valley, California. I went on opening day. This Titanic exhibit was different from some of the others. It displayed recovered artifacts that were pulled from the water at the time of the sinking and items that were passed down through the survivors' families. Not to my surprise, there was a whole display case almost entirely devoted to Edwina Trout Mackenzie, with several of the items she had kept and that I had viewed in her living room some 37 years before. Also on display were some of the Cameron Titanic movie set pieces, the grand staircase clock, a few wrought iron replica balustrades from around the staircase, Rose and Cal's suite, the Marconi wireless room, several costumes, a full-sized lifeboat from the film, Cameron's 1/30th scale dive planning model of the bow section, the Snoop ROV that was actually used in the movie and ventured into Titanic, and 8 original paintings by Ken Marshall. It seemed that I had seen some of these items before, because many of the film items displayed were among the very same items I saw a long time ago down at the Fox Baja Studios. One thing I noticed during my day at the exhibit was that the grand staircase clock had no wreath. I had a mold of the wreath that I used for my grand staircase clock that I made, so I contacted the museum and asked if they would like me to donate a wreath so their clock, the original set piece from the film, could be complete. I pulled the mold out of storage, poured the casting, cleaned and primed it, and the next day delivered it to the museum. Now it sits as part of the original grand staircase clock from the movie. Then on July 4th, 2017, yet another Titanic exhibit opened on the Queen Mary in Long Beach called Titanic in Photographs. The exhibit had large photographs and artifacts from Olympic and Titanic. It even had the only surviving lifeboat from Titanic's tender, the SS Nomadic. In the years that have passed, the Wilbur School in Somerset, Massachusetts, has been closed down. Miss McAndrew has long retired from teaching. The library will never again have a copy of A Night to Remember, and the name Titanic will never be heard again in my former second grade classroom. In December of 1984, Edwina Winnie Trout Mackenzie passed away at the age of 100. Ghosts of the Abyss was released in 2003, which saw James Cameron return to the wreck of Titanic, this time in 3D. In 2012, Titanic was reissued in 3D to theaters, which added to its already immense box office totals. Spurred by the discovery of the wreck in 1985 and the Cameron film in 1997, hundreds of Titanic-related books have been and continue to be published. Although not at the same pace as in its early years, Harland & Wolff is designing and building offshore oil platforms and wind farms, and of course, ship design, building, and repair. In Belfast, across Queen's Road from Harland & Wolff, is a new development named appropriately Titanic Quarter. It includes apartments, condominiums, and shopping. The old offices and drawing rooms of Harland & Wolff are now hotel rooms and meeting spaces called Titanic Hotel Belfast. The old slipways are now a monument to the building of Titanic, many other ships, and the Great Arrow Gantry. In the middle of it all, a symbolic building was erected housing a top-notch Titanic museum known as Titanic Belfast. Along Queen's Road in the historic Hamilton Graving Dock sits the SS Nomadic, which had been towed from the River Seine, where I saw it in Paris, to Le Havre, France, where it was saved from the shipbreakers and returned to its birthplace in Belfast. The Nomadic underwent a complete restoration inside and out, with the replacement of several features that were removed over the years. The funnel was replaced, and the ship was painted with the original White Star Line color. The hull was secured by the original builder, Harland & Wolff. Today, the SS Nomadic is a major attraction of the Titanic Quarter in Belfast. The Southampton Maritime Museum was closed, and its contents moved to a new complex called Sea City Museum, also located in Southampton. After Titanic, several big-name films were shot at Fox Baja Studios, some using the very tank Titanic was set in. A few years later, 20th Century Fox sold the studio, and all of the props and sets were sent back to Los Angeles and put in storage. The name was changed to Baja Studios, and a few more films were shot there. A few miles away from the studio, the landfill where most of the set pieces were discarded has been cleared, and no trace exists of the treasures it once held. Meanwhile, back in Belfast in 2001, just a year after my visit, an interesting fact was discovered by my friend Jim Carlisle and some members of the Belfast Titanic Society. They discovered that in 1912, the location of 12 Windsor Avenue was in fact up the street from the current 12 Windsor Avenue, the location of the ash-rowan townhouse where I stayed, and where the architect of Titanic, Thomas Andrews, reportedly once lived. They learned that over the years, the street numbers shifted as new buildings on the street were being built. They found that the actual former home of Thomas Andrews, called Dunallen, is in fact located at the old 1912 12 Windsor Avenue, which is now 20 Windsor Avenue. For over the last 50 years, it has been the offices of the Irish Football Association. Upon this new address discovery, the Ulster History Circle placed a blue plaque on the building, designating it to be an official Titanic landmark. The Irish Football Association has since moved from the building. Down the street, stripped of its Thomas Andrews Titanic history, the ash-rowan townhouse, reportedly under new ownership, continues to operate as a friendly bed and breakfast. Just as I was polishing the last of this narration in November of 2017, it was announced that James Cameron's Titanic would be re-released in an enhanced Dolby Vision 2D and 3D format in a limited theatrical run to commemorate the 20th anniversary release of the film in December of 2017. I attended the special screening a few days before the official opening. After the screening, there was a Q&A with director James Cameron and producer John Landau. Also late in November of 2017, National Geographic and executive producer James Cameron premiered a brand new documentary which examined over 20 years of newly discovered facts and ideas from Cameron and other Titanic historians. This one-hour special, called Titanic 20 Years Later with James Cameron, also commemorates the 20th anniversary of the film. Every year that goes by, the wreck of Titanic disintegrates slowly at the bottom of the ocean. Only time will tell how long it lasts. Here in Studio City, California, I still have my collection of Titanic-related books, a small White Star Line and Cunard collection on display, and my little pieces of the actual Titanic. I also have a small fragment of the former Arrow gantry that I picked up while I was in Belfast. I have several souvenirs of the film set, a portion of the full-size hull, my copy of the Grand Staircase clock, a first-class dining room chair, a life jacket, some reproductions that I built, and I even have the California license plates that I had on my truck for years, Harland & Wolff 401, the hull number of Titanic. Several people I know have extensive Titanic collections in their homes, with both actual historical items and items from the film set. And finally, one of my most prized possessions is a painting that my late friend Stephen Wolfe Smith painted for me as a Christmas gift one year. The Titanic legacy will go on and on. A whole new generation is discovering the Titanic. Coming soon, a high-end computer game and educational tool called Titanic Honor and Glory. You'll be able to play it in game mode, or you can simply wander the halls, rooms, and decks of Titanic that have been expertly created like never before. In the future, museums and exhibits will always continue to flourish with the possibilities of new Titanic discoveries. Titanic started for me in my second grade classroom way back in 1960, and it still has the power to get me to go to the newest exhibit, buy the new book, read the latest article, or watch the newest documentary, which will no doubt not be too far away.